What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to a little series that I'm calling Inside the Mind of Coffin Joe. Of course, based on the Inside the Mind of Coffin Joe box set from Arrow Video. This is part 2. Kind of what I'm trying to do here is do the ultimate deep dive. These are a series of films I'm unfamiliar with, a character that I'm completely unfamiliar with. And I kind of wanted to dive headfirst in and just kind of bring you along and create kind of what I want to be the definitive guide to this box set. Everything from packaging to the films and discussions and breaking down the bonus features and all of that great stuff. So this is part 2. In the last video, which I'll link, I don't know, somewhere in here, we dove into disc 1, which was At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul, the 1964 Brazilian horror film, and then we dove into the strange world of Jose Mojica Marines, which is the documentary, kind of taking a look at the director, who's also the actor, and all that stuff, and it was a great documentary. So now to follow up, we are on disc 2, which is right here, and this is kind of what I would consider the point at which this box set, to me, built the most appeal. I talk about how in the last video, At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul was great. I had a ton of fun with it. I thought it was awesome. The documentary that was in that disc really kind of helped me bring the character into a new perspective, diving into the rest of this box set. So I was really excited to continue forward and see kind of what it's going to do for me. Kind of having all this inside information, all this insight in who he was as a creator, as a director, and as an actor as well. And a lot of what is shown as far as the most controversial clips in the documentary were actually from the film that's on this disc that we're going to be covering today. And this was a pretty landmark time. This is, I believe this is 1967. So on this disc we have the direct sequel to At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul, This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse, and then also on this disc we have The Strange World of Coffin Joe, which is not a sequel to the sequel. It is actually a standalone anthology film. So let's, before we dive too far into the movies, you open it up. Of course, I'm going to show you both cover arts because they're actually on discs that are on paper stock that's here in front of me. But you open it up and then you have both films on one disc. Let me show you that art there, if it'll focus on that. So there's your disc art. Both films are on here. Both films share the same bonus features. And then you have reversible cover art that features, each side features art that I'm about to show you on these card stocks here. It's really nice. I talked about it in the last video, just how great these are. So at first we have the newly commissioned art for This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse. This is, like I said, the direct sequel to At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul. And it's actually the only sequel until 2008 where the third film of the trilogy finally came out. So this is your, I'm guessing, original poster art there. And then for The Strange World of Coffin Joe, this is the newly commissioned art. Beautiful artwork. I said in the last video, like, this is some of my favorite art to date from Arrow. And that's high praise. And this is that original poster there. So great, thick cardstock for both of these. These are going to go right back in the case. So coming into this set, I had, like I mentioned, a much kind of clearer perspective on the character and kind of where, you know, watching documentaries and information on this stuff that are deep dives before actually watching the bulk of the films is always tough because you get, you know, there were some things that were spoiled for me that I wish weren't. But at the same time, I think knowing what I did and going into these films with that knowledge, I think helped me to a certain extent kind of understand and go into it with a perspective that I might not have just going in blind, right? And I'll never discourage somebody from going into something blind. I think that's great. And for the most part, I was. I didn't really get... I didn't know that a lot of the stuff I saw in that documentary on Disc One was in this film. But the kind of some of the stories and stuff behind This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse are really crazy. So the film picks up exactly where At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul ends. And spoiler warning if you haven't seen these or if you don't care. We're going to talk about some plot details and stuff. But it picks up pretty much right where the first film ends. Where we kind of presume that Coffin Joe is dead. Obviously we know he's not. This is a trilogy. We know he's not dead. It picks up exactly where the original film starts off. And I will say that this is 3 years later. So this is 1967. There is a renewed energy to the beginning of this film that clearly shows a confidence behind the camera. And the opening credits is actually some of my favorite opening credits I've seen in a while. And it's this kind of montage of some events that happened in the first film. And kind of his recovery, because he was blind. He lost his eyesight in that event. And he, simply by laying in a hospital bed and having like a cloak over his eyes, somehow it healed his eyesight perfectly with the help of some doctors. And we pretty much pick up right where we kind of left off, where Coffin Joe arrives back in town, and he is continuing on his journey to find a pure woman who can give birth to his son, whom he believes is the kind of extension and the set-in of his bloodline. He believes he has to have a son, and it has to have a son from a pure woman. So coming into... He's back into town. He's back into his business. We're introduced to his helper at the business. And pretty much he wastes no time getting right back to business, finding these women. So he proceeds to kidnap 6 women and put them through a test to find out which one is pure or not. And it's a really strange thing, because he kidnaps these 6 women and they're all in a room, in a nice room with their own individual beds and their own individual this or that, and it doesn't really seem like much is holding them there. I know it's a movie and you need these things to happen to advance plot and stuff, but it doesn't really seem like there's much going on keeping them there. They're just kind of like nicely, pretty much like if I was kidnapped, this is where I would want to be. It's very nice. It looks very comfortable. It's a very, very strange situation. But he proceeds to put them through a test. To see kind of like which one of them fits best, basically. And that test is unleashing a bunch of spiders into the room and kind of testing their reactions. And this was one of the scenes that was sort of unknowingly spoiled to me in the documentary, because the shooting conditions for this film were reportedly not well. There wasn't really an animal safety expert there, so there were just large tarantulas all over the place, kind of uncontrollable. And there are shots, it's a very extended sequence of when the tarantulas are let into the room and they're crawling all over the women. At moments, there's one woman who has 6 to 7 of them on her face, and they're just walking around, and it takes them forever to wake up. I could have like a hairball from, whatever, roll across my leg on my sleep when I shoot awake, and these women have sometimes 10, 12 tarantulas on them, and they're just passed out. So that's how comfortable it was in that room. And so it's this extended sequence, and the shooting conditions weren't great. And multiple women threatened to leave the set. They did not want to be involved in production anymore. They just kind of had enough. And that's just the beginning of kind of some of the issues that began to arise on set for this film. And anyway, he kind of he finds the woman that he believes is good enough through this test to carry his child, and that proceeds to a sort of a love-making sequence where the trap door on the floor opens, much like the fire pit from Austin Powers, and down below are all the women that are not good enough to carry his son. And this is when shooting conditions really got worse, because the pit that they are in begins to be flooded with snakes, and not just like, you know, little tiny snakes, massive snakes that reportedly are not fun to be around. I'm not cool around snakes, but this was reportedly the worst of the environment to shoot in, and all of these women are killed, and then you have killed by snakes. It's really, you know, it's just funny, right? These movies aren't like technically the most incredibly well. They just kind of a jump cut, and the snakes are kind of all covered in them. It's really wacky. So anyway, and there's a bunch of really interesting sequences that begin to show up, and this is where I think This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse really takes that next step. There's an insanely creepy sequence that was actually inspired on a nightmare that Jose Mujica Marines had, where he wakes up, and the film is shot in black and white, beautiful black and white. The restoration on these discs are absolutely incredible. They look insane. He wakes up and there is a black figure standing in his room. The black figure begins to drag him out of his bedroom into a graveyard. These shots in the graveyard are so awesome. There's hands shooting out of freshly dug graves. Just all kinds of great gothic imagery, just littered in style. This proceeds to turn into the first color sequence of the film, actually the only color sequence of the film, where Coffin Joe is drug into hell. And it's a really cool sequence, because all these movies have different interpretations of hell and what that might look like. But down here you have some pretty wicked imagery going on. Some pretty... Nothing that's, you know, insanely crazy, but it's enough for you to... It really brought me in, and I was like, this is kind of crazy to be seeing. His interpretation of what hell might look like, and that's based on... There's these moments of people kind of stuck in the wall and they're being whipped and lashed, and people crawling on the floor, they're being whipped and lashed. And he proceeds to see himself as the devil down there, until he wakes up. And that's not really... It's interesting because Coffin Joe, the character, is heavily anti-Christian. Super heavy-handed, which might be one of the major downfalls of these films, is that there is no questioning of his beliefs, and therefore the character never really goes through what we see as any sort of change or progression or regression. And I get it, like people say these are horror films, they're not really kind of meant to be that, but this is long before horror kind of just fell into that mold, and became very... up until recently, for the most part, very one-dimensional in our characters, in our villains, I'll say. And this is just one of those, like, it just leans into his belief that he is who he thinks he is, which is kind of not the devil, but, you know, kind of an interpretation per se. He does not fit in with everybody in his town. He does not have the same beliefs. He does not have the same trust or lean on religion like everybody else does, and he sees himself as better than them because of that. And it makes for a really interesting sequence, because we don't know if this is... Obviously it's a dream, it's a nightmare, we don't know if it's real or not. And it kind of raises some questions about where this trilogy is going to go with the third film, and what they're going to continue to do with this character. And I felt like this only being a trilogy kind of holds it back a little bit. I can't wait to watch that third film that's way later in the box set and kind of see where that story goes. But one really kind of crazy is the Brazilian censor boards forced Jose Mujica Marines to change the ending of this film, which is crazy because at this time, the character of Coffin Joe kind of became the Brazilian Freddy Krueger, where parents were... their parents were kind of like threatening their kids with him. They're like, oh, if you don't go to bed, Coffin Joe is going to come and get you, basically, which is scary. I mean, he was everywhere. He was in newspapers, on advertising, and all. It's crazy. Like, Coffin Joe became a horror sensation, kind of all over. Like, it was pretty nuts when you see in the documentary some of the articles written for him, the pictures of people he was with, he was surrounding himself with. People loved him, and people loved Coffin Joe. So for the ending of this film, the Brazilian censor board actually forced him to change the ending, that Coffin Joe finds God, and it's very forced upon, and you could tell as a viewer how forced upon it is, because the sequence goes from him ripping the cross out of a priest's hand and throwing it at the townspeople who were trying to kill him, to all of a sudden he is in a mud puddle with a skeleton and he finds Jesus. And it's very like it seems like something completely different was just shot and inserted into the movie. It's very out of place, and there's no progression to that. There's not like multiple events have happened to make us kind of start to see that happening. It just happens and the movie ends, and it's weird. It's a really odd ending, and I don't know for sure, but if that's the reason why it took Jose Mojica Marin so long to do a third film, I could see why. That probably left a pretty poor taste in his mouth to end the second film in his trilogy that way, but it didn't hinder him, I don't think, at all as a character, because the second film on this disc, which is The Strange World of Coffin Joe, we see Coffin Joe becoming a host. He is hosting an anthology of films directed by him, but still a horror host. And I went into The Strange World of Coffin Joe really excited, because I loved This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse. I had a ton of fun with it. I thought it was like the quintessential, I still think, because I haven't moved forward in a box set, but to me, that is the quintessential Coffin Joe experience for me. It was just much more daring, much more confident. There was so much more nudity and violence than I really expected from at the time. It was very cruel. So to me, I was like, okay, this is everything I wanted from Coffin Joe out of that first movie, and I got that and a little bit more. So going into The Strange World of Coffin Joe, an anthology featuring 3 short films, I was excited. I was like, yeah, this is cool. This is, we're no longer following the storyline. We just gotta get to see 3 unique stories. I appreciate this guy's vision. Like, I'm excited to see it. And I didn't come out loving The Strange World of Coffin Joe as much as I thought I would. And anthologies are really tricky. We all know how many come and go. It's kind of a genre that hasn't really had a true comeback because it's very difficult to do, I think. So these are 3 short films that are introduced by Coffin Joe, and it's been about a week since I've seen them. So if I miss any little details, I'm sorry. But the first story, the first short film to me was my personal favorite, and it told the story of a doll maker who deals with a home invasion by a couple of townsmen. They're like in their 20s, who find out how much money he has. He doesn't believe in banks, and then he stashes it all under his bed, basically. So they break into his home to rob him, and then they see that he has 4 beautiful daughters who help him make the dolls. And this turns into a pretty extended sequence of what kind of begins as rape. Is there's 4 men and there's 4 daughters. They enter the room and it begins very forceful, and then we kind of see this change in the girls, where they all compliment their eyes, and then they begin to kind of get into what's happening. And this was one of the scenes where I was actually kind of shocked at because this is 1968 at this point. I was shocked at the nudity. First of all, that was pretty shocking to me, the amount of it in the scene. But they begin to compliment their eyes, all of their eyes, and then they really get into it. And before things get too crazy, it is found that the doll maker is indeed alive. And we find out that they ripped out their eyes and are using them in the dolls. Right? That's a cool, short story to me. I liked it. It was short. It was interesting. It kind of came in, got it done, told a cool story, and at the end you're like, oh, that's kind of gross. And it made its way out. And at the end of that first little short, it's like 13 minutes. I was like, oh, hell yeah, this is awesome. And then the second one came along. And I try not to bash too much, but the second story tells the story of this balloon seller who is a necrophiliac with a foot fetish, and it's more of a silent film style where this kind of tune that bops along the whole time, and he becomes obsessed with this woman, and he's following her around. She's giving him no attention whatsoever. She dies, and that after she gets buried in the mausoleum, he goes in and just begins to be weird with the corpse. And that was it. It was like 16 minutes, and I had no interest in it whatsoever. That's when I began playing on my phone a little bit. I didn't understand. I didn't find any sort of merit in it. And I was a little disappointed. I was like, okay, that was a little weird, but there's one more story. It's fine. And then you go into story number 3, which begins to tell a story of a professor played by Jose Mujica Marines. Very Coffin Joe-esque. It's not Coffin Joe, but Coffin Joe-esque. And he is a professor who is conducting this study on kind of like this weird sexual cannibalism. And it's a much, much, much better story. I think it runs 23 minutes in length. So it's got a little bit more substance behind it. More of the cruel nature that you're kind of looking for when you're watching films like this. But kind of the high that I was riding after This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse dipped down with The Strange World of Coffin Joe. And I greatly appreciate his vision as a director and as a filmmaker. And I do think that all of the shorts in the anthology film are well shot. I think they're well done. But none of them really did much for me outside of the doll maker. That was the only one I really remember a ton of details about. So I wrapped that up and I was like, okay, I hope from here this set doesn't kind of take a weird turn and bring me into more like that, because I wasn't really too into what was happening in The Strange World of Coffin Joe. I thought him as a host, Coffin Joe as a host, was great. He only appears in the beginning and at the end. I thought that was great, but I was like, man, I hope this guy doesn't kind of like take a weird turn and his films end up becoming, I don't know, just not good outside of the main Coffin Joe trilogy. So I dove into the bonus features on this disc, which are great. Little longer. So on here there's an audio commentary, which I didn't watch. An audio commentary for This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse. That's with the director. There's a filmmaker and a film scholar on that as well. There's also a commentary on The Strange World of Coffin Joe, with the same 3 people as well. But there was a fantastic interview on here called The Eccentric of Cinema. And this was actually an interview with Stephen Thrower, who was the author of Nightmare USA. A fantastic book on horror films. It runs about a little over an hour in length. And I kind of just was folding laundry during and listening. It's a great insight into kind of like some of the influences and stuff of Coffin Joe and some of the literature influences on him. So I had a lot of fun with that. And then my favorite is actually a bit called On Tonight's Horror Show. And this is a video essay by Miranda Corcoran. She is a film historian. That kind of goes through in a matter of like 13 minutes a whole a whole history of horror hosts, kind of covering everybody from Vampira all the way up to your Svengoolie and Coffin Joe, where he played a role in that. And I thought that was such a fantastic little video essay. I don't really, not extremely educated in hosts and stuff like that, but I got so much good information out of that little tiny essay. It made me kind of want to dive into horror hosts and stuff like that a little bit more than I do now. So some great extra stuff on this disc. There is also an alternative ending for The Strange World of Coffin Joe. You have your theatrical trailers, which are all newly scanned from the original 35mm negatives. And a reversible, the sleeve with newly commissioned artwork by Butcher Billy, who did all of the artwork on this disc. So, kind of moving forward, because next we have, let's check this out. Let's open this thing up and get these out of here. Whoa! So, next up for me is going to end up being, I believe it's this one here. Yeah. Next one for me is going to end up being The Awakening of the Beast, which is getting more into different horror work from Jose Mujica Marines, because we're not going to see that return of that main Coffin Joe through line until 2008 with what's that film called? I forget what that one's called. Yeah, with the final film in the trilogy. But I am super excited to continue moving forward in the set. I think the set is just, it's such an incredible release, and I'm really hoping to see new stories coming from Jose Mujica Marines, because so far at this moment all I really have is the first two Coffin Joe films, the second being the best of the two so far, and kind of a little bit of an offbeat and a little lag with The Strange World of Coffin Joe. But as his fame and as his popularity grew, and as film kind of changed, because coming into this, we're in, I believe, the early 70s, I want to say. Doesn't say for sure, but going into the next disc, we're getting into the early 70s, and therefore horror is changing. The acceptance of violence and a little bit more cruelty is changing, and I'm kind of curious to see where he goes from here and how he embodies that kind of stuff as well. Also kind of interested to see if there is any sort of genuine change of course for his religion, his religious views, or his anti-Christian views. I'm kind of interested to see what he does with that. And to be completely honest, I'm more so kind of just looking forward to seeing kind of what the hell is going to happen. I mean, this guy has such a great eye for imagery and that gothic style. So I'm really excited to move forward and continue seeing what's going on here. And of course, I'm bringing you guys along. So if you're still here, 28 minutes into this Disc 2 preview, let me know what you think below. Let me know if you picked up the Inside the Mind of Coffin Joe Blu-ray set from Arrow Video. And moving on to part 3. So I'll catch y'all there.